Hey everyone, this is David. I know you're used to hearing me jump into lesson plans and share what I'm doing right now in my classroom, but this week I wanted to try something different. I'm pulling an episode out of the podcast archives to share an interview I did in 2018. That spring, I interviewed 10 different people to ask them about their experiences with Orff Schulwerk and to help get a better perspective of what Orff Schulwerk is, what it isn't, pedagogy, teaching ideas, what you can expect should you decide to do Orff Levels training, why you should visit a local Orff chapter, and lots more. These interviews were so fun and fascinating, and I wanted to share them again with y'all. Thanks so much for listening. Here's the show. Hey everyone, welcome to episode 26 of Make Moments Matter, a music education podcast, where I share lesson ideas, songs, games, and inspiring things for your elementary music classroom. My name is David Rao, and I am the music teacher who blogs at makemomentsmatter.org. You can also find my ideas on Facebook, Pinterest, Instagram, Twitter, and a variety of other platforms when you search my name or Make Moments Matter. Normally on this podcast, I spend the episode sharing teaching tips, lesson ideas, tricks for classroom management, and a whole host of other topics. For the next few weeks, I'll be doing something a little different. In these episodes, I'm taking some time away from the normal routine to conduct a series of interviews with music teachers from around the country. I want to take a little time to really think and talk about Orff Schulwerk, what it is, what it isn't, pedagogy, teaching ideas, what you can expect should you decide to do training or a local Orff chapter, and more. Maybe you've been to a workshop at a local Orff chapter or have seen a presenter at your state conference who's trained in Orff Schulwerk. These sorts of experiences are great, but definitely don't give you the full picture. And I want more people to really know about the ins and outs of the Orff approach, how to utilize the pitch percussion instruments that are so often associated with Orff Schulwerk, ideas about teaching recorder, movement, resources, and a whole lot more. Throughout this series of conversations, I'll be talking with leaders in the world of Orff Schulwerk and people who have lived with this teaching approach. If you've missed the last few episodes, you'll definitely want to go back and hear my conversations with Tiffany English, Jennifer Donovan, and Beth Moline Nelson. In each of those conversations, we cover a variety of Orff Schulwerk related topics from recorder to pitch percussion, lesson scaffolding, movement, online resources, and a ton more. In this episode, I get a chance to talk with my friend Natasha Thurmon. Natasha teaches K-5 music at Bolt Elementary in the Northside Independent School District in San Antonio, Texas. Natasha has presented at state workshops and conferences around the country and teaches recorder for Orff Schulwerk Levels courses at Trinity University. Before I get into my interview with Natasha, I wanted to share about some really cool resources that are available to use as inspiration and as a reference. As you may know, Orff Schulwerk, or the Orff approach to teaching music, stems from the work of German composer Karl Orff. Orff and his contemporaries, Gunhild Kettmann and Dorothy Gunther, developed an approach to teaching music which flourished in Germany in the early 1900s. Their school trained young adult women in elemental music and dance. As music director, Orff was able to realize his ideas of improvised music played on drums, rattles, pitch percussion instruments, and recorders. Their school was closed due to political pressure in 1944 and was destroyed by bombing in 1945. After World War II, the Schulwerk was recast not for young women but for children through a series of broadcasts on Bavarian radio in 1948. Selected repertoire from the broadcasts composed by Karl Orff and Kettmann were published as the 5 volumes of Orff Schulwerk, also known as Musik für Kinder or Music for Children. These books, often reverently just referred to as the volumes, contain a wealth of material and ideas that teachers today can study, play, explore, and use in their classrooms. One really wonderful resource that can be used to enhance the understanding of those written volumes are audio recordings. The most popular audio recording of work from the volumes comes from Schott Publishing. In 1990, Schott released a 3-CD set featuring recordings actually directed by Carl Orff himself and Hermann Regner. This recording features songs and pieces from the 5-volume English edition by Margaret Murray of Carl Orff and Gunhild Keetmann's Schulwerk, known as Music for Children. Singers and speakers on these recordings are from a variety of English, Welsh, and German schools, with professional musicians playing instruments. I'll include a link to a listing for this resource in the show notes. Another wonderful recording that I learned about in the last year or so comes from the company Archive Music and features recordings in German of music from Orff's many volumes. The audio recording, titled Musica Poetica, features children from the Munich State School of Music. I'll also include a link to this recording in the show notes. Both audio recordings are a really wonderful resource to have and give you, the listener, a look into what your students could sound like. While the first set of CDs I mentioned is an actual recording of music that's under the direction of Carl Orff himself, remember that the Orff approach is all about making the music your own and giving students choices. Use these recordings as an inspiration and not as a standard by which you try and judge your own students' music making. I'll include a link to both CD recordings in the show notes so that you can go and listen to recordings of the music from the volumes. Remember that the first one, published by Schott, is called Music for Children and features recordings in English, and the second recording, known as Musica Poetica, is a publication of Archive Music and features recordings in German. Natasha Thurmon teaches K-5 music at Bolt Elementary in the Northside Independent School District in San Antonio, Texas. She is the immediate past president of the Central Texas Orff chapter. Natasha has presented at various state workshops and serves as a member of the Professional Development Committee of the Northside American Federation of Teachers. She serves on the American Orff Schulwerk Association website and social media subcommittees, and recently graduated with a master's degree in music from the University of Texas in San Antonio. Well, Natasha Thurmon, thanks so much for taking the time to talk with me today.
Of course. Nice to be here.
Well, before we get too far into the conversation, could you tell the listeners just a little bit more about yourself? Where do you teach, the grades you teach, and maybe something fun about where you live?
Sure. I am in my 9th year of teaching in the Northside Independent School District here in San Antonio, Texas. I teach kinder through 5th grade general music. I also teach 5th grade strings. I do a 4th and 5th grade choir in the fall, as well as a year-round Orff ensemble with my 5th graders. I actually moved to San Antonio about a decade ago, and I moved here kicking and screaming and actually realized it's a great place to be. San Antonio is one of the biggest tourist attraction areas in Texas. We also always host our yearly Texas Music Educators Association conference, which is the biggest in the nation. And if you haven't been, it's definitely worth taking the time to come see one year.
I have wanted to go every year. I hear great things about TMEA.
It's something else.
Well, how did you become a part of the Orff community, or what drew you to Orff Schulwerk?
Well, in my undergraduate, I took the required elementary general education classes, and of course I knew I was going to be a famous high school choir director one day, because that's what we all expected, right? Mm-hmm. And then I fell in love with elementary music, and I had a great undergrad professor who was well versed in Orff and Kodály and a lot of the different approaches and methodologies. We were required to go to workshops for certain classes that we took, and I fell in love. Then when I started teaching here in Texas, I was very lucky to be in a district that strongly supports our local Orff chapter and even has a local Orff levels course. So to know that going to workshops would be sponsored, as well as for all 3 of my levels trainings to be sponsored, there's no way I could have said no to making myself a better teacher. And it's been, usually people say it's been downhill from there, but it's definitely been uphill from there, because I absolutely love using the Orff approach in my classroom.
And how great that you have such a supportive district and community near you.
Yes, we're very lucky, for sure.
Well, can you give it just a brief 2-minute or less description of the Orff Schulwerk approach?
Yeah. Usually, the first thing I think and remember is those three words, right? Imitation, exploration, and improvisation. And then sometimes people add composition at the end of that as well. And I do think those three words can really summarize Orff in a nutshell. But to break it down just a little more, if you're starting with imitation, that's where the kids can be comfortable and just simply do what the teacher is doing, right? Then when they move into exploration, well, they can start, playing around with the things that they've been musically given. And then in the improvisation stage, they're beginning to make musical choices, which is really amazing, especially when you think of young children doing that. But most important, if it doesn't have student choice, it's not Orff. Sometimes what Orff is gets a little construed, it has to have barred instruments, it has to have this, it has to have that. And none of that is necessarily true. It's really about if there's student choice, student creativity, if the students are taking ownership somehow in the music that they are making, then there's a pretty good chance it's probably Orff.
Yeah, and it's so cool. As you were talking about that, I was sitting here sort of reflecting on, what my classroom has been like since I took, my Orff training and my Orff levels, and then thinking, that is not at all what I had growing up as a child, and how different would I be if I had had that?
Right. I remember one lesson only where the teacher took out the instruments, the barred instruments, and I thought it was the most exciting thing, and we took turns and she told us what to do, and that's all we ever got to do. But that one memory is the one thing I remember.
Yeah, and just think of your students walking out of their years with you and all the cool memories and experiences they'll have.
I hope so.
Well, do you think there are any common misconceptions about Orff Schulwerk or levels training or another aspect of the Orff world?
Yes, unfortunately. I think most people associate Orff with instruments, or there's this idea that, if someone was an undergraduate studying choral music, then they should take Orff to make themselves stronger with instruments, or vice versa. If they were a band person, they should take Kodai. And I don't think that those things necessarily correlate that easily. As I had mentioned earlier, people think that Orff is about the instruments, and it's really not, right? It's about that element of student creativity. Also, when people take their Orff levels, I hear a lot of my former students, sometimes they'll say, oh, well, I took level 1, and I really don't work with older kids, and I don't feel like there's anything else I can gain from level 2 or level 3. And level 2 and level 3 is when you really start digging into some really great pedagogy and teaching techniques that are so valuable for your students. And our course here in San Antonio, level 2 involves an element of group teaching, and then in level 3, you're doing an individual lesson on your own, getting feedback and more information from a master teacher. And that's so incredibly invaluable. Do I necessarily use a lot of the technical stuff that's taught to me? Well, yes, as an Orff instructor, yes, I do. But I could see some people still learning a lot from taking level 2 and level 3, even if it's not necessarily the songs or the material that you would take away, but from the strength you would gain as an educator.
That is so interesting that you reflect on levels that way, because I think you're right. When you were saying that, I was thinking back to my levels, and I was thinking of the binders I walked away with all the lessons and resources. But really, the most valuable aspects that I gained in level 2 and level 3 were teaching my peers and then getting that feedback from a master teacher.
Mm-hmm. That's incredibly powerful. And I think that anytime anyone tells me, well, I'm not sure, should I come back or not, the answer for me is always a resolute yes. You won't regret it, especially if you're in a district like mine and they're often able to cover the cost. Free training for 2 weeks, there's no way that you should turn that down.
Yeah, and the people who teach levels courses are so good. I mean, the brilliant, brilliant minds who have been teaching that way for so long and know what they're doing. It's a great place to learn.
Oh, yeah, and you create communities. Teachers you can send emails to and text and call. for years into your career. The folks who I did my levels with will be lifelong friends of mine forever.
Well, I know that something that seems just completely universal in the elementary music world is the recorder. I mean, it's everywhere, and it feels like it's been everywhere forever. But I know that it's an integral part of Orff Schulwerk, so I was wondering, could you give us just a brief history of how the recorder ties into the Orff Schulwerk approach?
Absolutely. Well, and the recorder is an instrument that's hundreds of years old, and it really experienced its heyday in the medieval and Renaissance period. And then once the Baroque era approached, it really started to struggle, especially with the introduction of the modern flute. And people started using it less and less, and it really kind of disappeared into obscurity. And in the 20th century, all of a sudden we started to experience this early music renaissance. Folks were really interested in bringing back early music again. And in Germany, in the mid-20th century, when the Grundschule was founded, this is this near experimental school for young women, not for children, almost university-esque, but still experimental. And they're playing around with all these movement and music ideas. They're finding instruments where they can. And Orff's good friend, Kurt Sachs, who was an ethnomusicologist, I believe, I could be saying that incorrectly, so I apologize if I am, but he said to him, you have these drums, so you should add a recorder, because then you'll have the wind to the drum. And the instrument was fresh in his mind because of this resurgence and interest in early music. So the school ordered some recorders, and when they got in, there were no fingering charts, there were no guides, lesson books, information, anything. And Kate Mon said, well, give them to me, I'll play around with them, I'll figure it out, and I'll get back to you. And that's exactly what she did, which is pretty amazing. How many times can you think of getting an instrument and just saying, yeah, let me figure it out? It's the only thing I can think of is like when you see small children playing the piano and they just, not necessarily with any lessons, but they're just playing, experimenting, seeing what happens. And that's in essence where she started until she figured out how to get different pitches and notes and sounds out. And, the next step was unfortunately the Grundschule, experienced an unfortunate demise because of World War II. But when the Schulwerk experienced its resurgence later on, a couple decades later, the recorder was brought along, and now it's continued forward even now into the 21st century.
So how does recorder sort of fit in with the modern approach in the United States today, or how does it fit into teaching? How does it integrate?
Yeah, it really was more popular in England at first, actually. That's really where it started. There were a lot of teachers experimenting with it there. And as teachers were traveling back and forth between England and the United States, that's when the recorder really started experiencing more popularity. And before the recorder, there were a lot of other instruments like flutophones and stuff like that, which were much lower quality. And people noticed the sound, and they didn't like the sound. And when they heard the difference of the quality of the sound with recorder, and with the advent of modern plastic, and the recorder became an affordable instrument for children to use in the classroom, that's really when it started to become very popular. Also used a lot in more middle school ages as well, with a lot of alto and tenor recorder use. And as that was already a part of the curriculum, as it had already been included in the Grundschule in the 20th century, it continued on into our American education system and with Orff as well. So when you take an Orff Levels course, you have your course split into 3 sections. Your basic, where you get your pedagogy and technique, movement, and recorder as well. When these courses first started, a lot of the recorder teachers were recorder professionals maybe, but they didn't necessarily have a strong pedagogical background in teaching recorder. But that's something that's really changed in the last few years, especially since AOSA has, what's the word I'm looking for? They have not created, but they've updated the standards for teaching recorder in our levels courses. And that has really helped the recorder teachers to make sure we're teaching not just pedagogy, but also technique to our students and for them to use with their students.
So I feel like there are a lot of ideas on how to teach the recorder, and in some ways it sort of feels like Kate Mon. Like I know I should be integrating this somehow, but I'm not sure how. And so as an Orff person, how do you use the recorder? Do you use it to when you teach notation, or do you use it for improvisation? How does it come into your classroom?
Yeah, that's a great question. Um, In my classroom, again, a lot is dictated by our district. The students are provided recorders in fourth grade, so it's an expectation that we teach it to them. However, really, it provides a great opportunity for some of that fine motor skill that we want for the students to have. I don't teach recorder with notation at the same time. We start early notation in first grade with maybe 2-3 line staffs, and we progressively incorporate into a 5-line staff, and the kids are learning about reading melodic notation from an early age, but it's almost like a big puzzle for them reading music, a very complicated puzzle with a lot more than 100 pieces. So if they're struggling with interpreting this puzzle, then when I give them a recorder, I don't want to make it even harder by having them read music and learn how to play this crazy instrument at the same time. So when we start with recorder, we back away from notation for quite a bit of time, just so they can focus on really getting comfortable with the instrument. And even when we start including notation back in, there's no reason to flood them with all this information. It's really developmentally inappropriate for their minds, right? To have to do all these things at once. So I really try to pull it back to the most simple and lowest common denominator for my kids. We don't even put our fingers on the holes the first time we play. We're just working on, tonguing, blowing air, not blowing out the music teacher's ears, right? Making it simple.
Right. So you start with the very simple and you add. I mean, that's great teaching, that's scaffolding, and once students are successful, you moved on to something else.
Yeah, but I remember my first couple years of teaching, I had this PowerPoint slide, and it had little rhythms and notes on the staff, and the kids had to read through and play every single one correctly before I would let them move on to the next one. And I think back on that now, and I'm like, God, they must have been so miserable when all they wanted to do was get to know this instrument, and I'm making them play random rhythms on B forever before I let them add another finger.
Right. And that it feels a little bit like a beginning band instrument, because in those beginning methods books, that's what you're doing, is just whole notes all on just that one note. And so now you're doing something different. You're letting them imitate and try and do different things.
Yeah, and they end up enjoying it and sticking with it a lot more. When you first give your kids the recorder, they're so excited to play, right? And then like a few weeks in, that excited energy is almost non-existent for some of your kids. They dread it. So what can I do to keep them interested in it? Because it's really hard, especially when you're talking about your kids with different exceptionalities who really struggle with those fine motor skills. They have to think about their air, their tongue, their fingers. Their left hand goes on top, and that feels weird. Are they fully covering the holes all the way? There's so many factors that tie into this teeny tiny instrument, and they can lose hope very quickly.
So sort of to talk about those, how do you keep kids from losing hope? You said that you start with just basic breath control and holding the instrument. Where do you go from there?
Well, usually, I have them hold on to a part of the recorder that doesn't have any fingers, and we just work on tonguing. So actually, we'll do some speech things and learn some speech poems and transfer it to tonguing. And then as we add fingers, I'll start with usually just one note. I've done the BAG method for many years, and this year I decided to try something different, and we started with G and went down to E. So we tackled the hardest thing right away. But for example, one of my beginning lessons, once they've learned how to finger G, there's a great little song from Volume 1, a cute little melody, and there are words to it that I got from Nick Wilde at Villanova when I shadowed with him about going to the zoo. Then they have to come up with different animals that they would see at the zoo and create a word chain. and then they have to take the rhythm of the word chain and play it on their instrument. I've added the level of complexity of having to be able to finger G correctly, but they're still not having to read notation yet. They just have to remember the animals that they came up with. And if they need to write it down, they can. They work in groups of 2 or 3, and that way, when we're playing and listening, I'm able to listen to smaller groups of kids and give them more one-on-one feedback on how they're doing.
That's so cool because I'm going to assume that you do activities like the word chain in class already. And so if you're already doing that, then you're just adding one component. Whereas I know that some teachers, like, they do a recorder unit, and so everything is focused on that. And so it almost feels high stress, that you've got to do recorder the whole time, and it's got to sound perfect right away because we only have this small amount of time. But if you integrate it the way that it sounds like you're doing, you're adding it, as just the next level to this set of activities that you've already been successful with.
Yeah, I like to call it another medium, and that's what I tell my kids. So you have to have a little bit of a unit at first because of all of that, fine motor skill involved, but there's no reason why that unit can't be already based on the teaching techniques that you use. So we do kind of focus on it a lot for a few weeks, but then it becomes an option with all the other options we have in our room: singing, dancing, playing barred instruments, playing unpitched percussion, playing recorder. And that way, it really allows you to differentiate your instruction for your kids too. You will have to have the lessons where everyone learns a new note and everyone has to show, their competency on that note, however long or short it takes them. But then you might do another activity that has an orchestration to it with a recorder part, and the kids who like recorder can play that part, and the kids who maybe like the barred instruments can do that instead.
Yeah, I was thinking when you were talking about the word chain, that could easily transfer to the instruments. So you could have, the barred percussion instruments, you could have some kids playing recorder and some kids on barred percussion, and you could switch. There are a lot of options there.
Yes, absolutely.
So I'm guessing you were talking about doing like the imitation and improvisation, and you're talking about G and E. I'm guessing that you eventually add more and more notes so that you end up with just a variety of notes that you can use in a lesson. And so I know some other people give students a visual or give students sort of representation so they know, like, these are the notes we know and here's what you can use in this example. I guess what I'm asking is, do you use something like a pitch stack or a pitch ladder that helps kids keep track of those things?
Sometimes, yes, depending on what the focus of the activity is. Of course, I have like my fingering charts in the front of the room, and I have a really big one that basically stretches out over, they're individual charts for each fingering, and they probably stretch out over 7 feet, I would guess. So pretty much any kid can see the fingering for any note wherever they are. But when we're doing an activity and I use something similar to a smartboard in my classroom, I always have a slide nearby that will either have just a pitch stack with the notes, or in the early stages, if we're only doing 2 or 3 notes, I will have the notes, like the letters, as well as the fingerings right there on the board so the kids can practice with it, because it is a lot for them to remember.
Right. And I know one of the things that I began to think a lot more about when I did my levels training was there are some kids who are such visual learners that they just so greatly benefit from seeing you put your fingers on the recorder, but also to see visual representations of what that looks like.
And that's interesting you bring that up, because Paul Krabari, who did his doctoral degree at Boston, he did a study with his 3rd grade students, and it was about him as the teacher standing behind them when they learned recorder, and him standing in front of them and giving them the ability to visually see his fingers while they were doing the same lessons. So the variable in the study was him either standing behind the kids or standing in front of them so they could see him. And I believe that he was quite surprised to find that there was almost no difference, which really caught me off guard because you would think that the kids being able to see your fingers would help, right? We
Right.
have so much anecdotal evidence because we see kids looking at our fingers to give them another source of knowledge and information to move forward.
Yeah, and but what a cool experience that if he's behind them, they're also probably really working their oral skills and listening and
Uh-huh.
finding different ways to understand.
Yeah.
Well, what are some of your favorite recorder activities? What are some things you love to do with the recorder?
Well, I mentioned the open, the volume one piece I talked to you about that little zoo thing, and I'll actually stretch that out for several lessons. We start with the Baby Elephant Walk by Henry Mancini, and we do a whole thing where they're holding a paper plate, and they're holding the plate in their right hand, and they're holding an imaginary cup of tea in their left hand to mimic their left hand being on top. So we do a whole mirroring activity with that song just to get them used to having their left hand on top. Gently blowing on the tea is the same thing as gently blowing air. And then we move into a poem about tea for the animals at the zoo. So that goes straight from the holding the tea to talking about the tea at the zoo. Then we do the zoo activity, and we do the zoo activity more than once because the second time around, they can only come up with animals that begin with G or E, and those animals transfer to fingerings G and E on their recorder. Or last year I did animals that begin with B and A, since we were doing B and A. I really love Carole King's Recorder Routes books. If y'all haven't bought that book, it is a great resource with some really fantastic Orff recorder lessons in them. They're not just recorder, they're truly in the Orff Schulwerk approach, which is really awesome.
Yeah, I was going to ask, what are some of the go-to recorder resources that you like to use throughout, the years that you teach students recorder?
Yeah, that one is really good. I also like, and it's kind of a source that's I don't think used as much anymore. The Isabel McNeil Carley has three recorder books that actually perfectly align with what you learn in level one, level two, and level three recorder as well. They're an older resource, but a really good resource to have too. Obviously, your volumes books, if you're an ORF trained instructor, and the biggest thing to remember is that in volume one, even though everything is pitched in C, you can easily transpose a piece to G and make it really accessible for kids who can play BAG on recorder.
Yeah, that's great to remember. I know that, when you go to the volume, sometimes you look at it and you're like, you get caught up in looking and don't think I could change that key to something more accessible.
Yep.
Well, but I have one more recorder question, and I think that this is one that we all sort of get nervous about every once in a while, but what do you think that we're doing wrong? What can we do to make recorder better for ourselves and for our students?
We touched on it a little earlier, but I think it's when we treat recorder as a pre-band instrument, and all of a sudden, especially for folks who are trained in the Orff approach, it's almost like sometimes we abandon all of that and go back to like method and
Right.
this recorder method. And I think we need to remember how overwhelming it can be for our students. This last summer, one of my level one students had taught choral music for over 30 years and had never touched a wind instrument in their life. And seeing a professionally trained musician struggling with the technique and skill necessary for a recorder, if an adult is having that trouble who is a musician, we have to think of how hard it is for our kids. I think we forget that perspective, and we need to remember that we need to pull it back and keep it as simple for them as possible and make it playful, make it joyful. Yeah, they're going to sound pretty terrible, but that's part of the experience for them, right? It's old for us because we've heard it how many times, but for them, it's part of the journey, which is really exciting for them. And on top of that, we need to remember that we can always model a good recorder sound for our kids. I regularly use my recorder in all my younger grade levels. If they're moving to something and I'm improvising on my recorder, one, it gives me practice time to make sure I remember my fingerings, but it also allows me to give them an early example of what good recorder playing is supposed to sound like. So many years later, when they get their recorder, they can be like, ooh, I just played that, and that does not sound like how I remember Miss Thurmon playing it all the time. I need to go back and take a look and see what I can do to fix it.
Yeah, it's fun how when I see great Orff teachers, I see them pull out the recorder all the time, and I'm like, man, I should do that so much more often because it gives kids such a great exposure at an early level. And I think I do it enough, but it's like, I could use this for everything. It's so accessible.
It's great too when you're sick, right? And you're having trouble.
Yes.
And my littles love when I take out my alto or my tenor recorder. Actually, all the kids like seeing the different sizes. And I do alto and tenor with my fifth graders, which really they enjoy a lot and keeps them hooked on the instrument.
Yeah, as you were talking about sort of beginning students, or even your student at the levels course who was a trained musician sort of struggling, it made me think, because I know that you're a runner and I'm a runner, and so I remember thinking, if you first start running, you sort of hate it for a while. I mean, most people. And then you sort of build endurance and you sort of learn tricks and you get better at it, and then it feels a lot better. But there are a lot of people who burn out on that first time on the treadmill because they don't have the skills or don't have the know-how of, like, we got to take it easy this first time or whatever, and they overload, and it sort of makes me think about how we do recorder.
Yeah, absolutely. And sometimes when we fall off of not literally fall off the treadmill, but when we fall off of that pattern, we don't have anyone necessarily there to encourage us and push us forward. And that's our job as teachers for our kids, right? Is, yes, I see you're struggling. Let me help you. We'll go through this together. I'm going to push you forward so you can be successful.
You're the trainer who's there, yes. The pacer who's there running with them.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, well, if you were a beginning teacher and you were looking through catalogs trying to figure out what recorders do I buy for my students, where would you look? What sort of things would you be looking for?
Yeah, that is a good question and a big question with a lot of different opinions. It really comes down to personal preference, because a teacher can choose between a 1, a 2, or a 3-piece recorder. They also have to figure out what their price range is, and if they'll be purchasing that with school funds, if they'll be asking students to purchase it, and what demographic of kids they're working with. So there's a lot of variables that a teacher has to research on their own to decide what's going to be the best choice for them and their kids. But it's also nice to consider different sizes in the consort. We really get stuck in the soprano recorder, but in the actual recorder world, the soprano is called the descant recorder, and the alto is really the main recorder that most professional musicians play. Since it's pitched lower, it's pitched in F instead of in C, the sound is a little bit warmer and richer. We use sopranos with our kids, obviously for technical reasons. The kids' hands are not quite big enough to get their fingers to cover the alto holes when they're in 3rd or 4th grade. But I do teach alto and tenor with my 5th graders, and sometimes I have a couple basses. I'll throw them in there, and if they've had a really good foundation in soprano recorder in 4th grade, they will eat it up in 5th grade. Tenor is an automatic and easy adjustment. Same fingerings, just an octave lower. Alto, which is an F, and bass are also an F. The fingering pattern is the same, it's just pitched differently. So, for example, on your soprano recorder, BAG is thumb 1, 2, and 3. On alto recorder, thumb 1, 2, and 3 is actually E, D, C. So you could do some really great stuff in C pentatonic, and it would be really accessible for your kids. My kids love playing an alto and tenor, and just a few weeks ago we ended up throwing in some ukulele on top of it, and they just thought they were the coolest things ever.
Well, yeah, I mean, if you're going to throw a ukulele, everybody loves that.
Right. Yeah, sometimes I feel like recorder is like the sad sibling that no one wants to hang out with anymore because everyone wants to hang out with the ukulele, and I'm like, but they can play together.
So, it's funny you mentioned that the alto and the tenor. I know of teachers who buy class sets of altos and have their students use those, and I know that it's a little bit more palatable if they take it home. It's a warmer sound, like you mentioned. But I think you're right when you said it's good to start with soprano because one, they're less expensive. So if the student's buying their own, it's an easier first purchase, and it is a better fit for their fingers.
Yes.
So I think I love what you're saying about moving to the alto and tenor. So it's good to have those available. Would you buy, like, if you were using them for your class, would you buy like a class set, or would you buy 5 or 6 just in case you get to that, or how would you maybe think about that?
It took me a few years to build those instruments. I started with a grant that I won, and I got, I'd say, about a half dozen of alto and tenor, and we kind of had to make it work and share. And as I've slowly won different grants or saved up money from this budget or that budget, I now have about 19 altos and about 15 or 16 tenors, I do believe. Every now and then one disappears and shows up again. I'm not sure where that's happening. But I also use my recorders at the Orff course that I teach at. So I use ones that are a little bit more expensive. If I weren't teaching adults as well, I think I probably could have built up my class sets a lot quicker and would have had a lot more much sooner. They're not too terribly expensive. Yes, more than soprano, but it's not inaccessible at all.
Okay, and now, because we're talking about class sets, can I ask you the sort of gross question
Sure.
of how do you clean the recorders?
Sure. I use alcohol wipes, the little individual ones, and I go through with the kids and I show them exactly how to do it. And we talk about how that's going to get rid of all the germs, but they have to clean the outside and the inside too. Usually I find the kids are not so grossed out by it so much as since I'm in an affluent area, parents can sometimes get more stressed out about these things than the kids do. If anything, I'm more concerned about the fact that the little wipe says alcohol on it and the kids get all silly about it. And we talk about the fact that it's not that kind of alcohol. And they realize, a lot of them say, oh, that's what they put on my arm when I go to the doctor and they give me a shot. And everyone says, oh, yeah. And then we move on.
Well, if you could tell music teachers out there one reason they should explore Orff Schulwerk, what would it be?
Honestly, there's no reason not to make yourself a better teacher, right? And even if you end up just taking that first level, that's 60 hours of training that you get from master teachers, as well as being immersed with other educators to make yourself a better teacher. On top of that, as I mentioned earlier, it's a great place to learn more about the recorder. So if you're interested in learning about technique for yourself and or pedagogy for your kids, that's the place to go. And AOSA just recently changed their guidelines for recorder. The requirement used to be 60 minutes a day, and now we're moving up to 75 minutes a day. So if recorder is something you really want to know more about, an Orff Schulwerk Levels course is a great place to get that information.
And there are some, I mean, if you're worried about time or money or whatever, there are grants available. There are things that are available that make Orff Levels courses really easy. And
Yeah, USA's got some great grants. One of my students actually, she just won the Cape Mon grant, and she moved away because her husband is in the military, but she'll be coming back this summer to rejoin us to take her level 3, and she's not having to pay out of pocket for it, which is amazing.
That's awesome. Well, Natasha Thurmon, I really want to thank you for taking the time to talk with me about your experience with Orff Schulwerk and sharing some really awesome tips and insights. This has been a great conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been fantastic.
Natasha Thurmon teaches K-5 music at Bolt Elementary in the Northside Independent School District in San Antonio, Texas. Natasha has presented at state workshops and conferences around the country and teaches recorder for Orff Schulwerk levels at Trinity University. If you have any questions for Natasha, you can email her at natasha.thurmon@gmail.com, and her last name is spelled Thurm as in Michael, O-N as in Nancy. That's all for this episode of the podcast, but check back in the coming weeks for more conversations with Orff specialists from around the country. If you're interested in learning more about Orff Schulwerk, finding a local Orff chapter, or attending Orff teacher training, you can find all the information you need at aosa.org. My name is David Rao, and you have been listening to Make Moments Matter, a music education podcast.